October 23, 1944. The sun had just begun to rise over the battered compound outside Leyte. The morning air smelled of ash and damp earth. Broken bamboo fences creaked in the wind, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a Japanese garrison loomed ahead like the husk of a predator that had fled the scene. Inside the shadow of one of the buildings, a group of women crouched in silence, ears tuned to every sound outside. For 3 years, footsteps had meant only one thing. The rhythm of boots across the compound yard usually announced drunken soldiers, fists, commands, and pain. But this morning, the cadence was different. Heavier, slower, more deliberate. And there were unfamiliar voices. Not the clipped syllables of Japanese, but something rougher, lower-pitched, unfamiliar. Through a narrow crack in the bamboo wall, Kim Sun-hee could see movement. Not the usual khaki uniforms, but soldiers in olive green, their helmets casting shadows across alert eyes. Their rifles were lowered but ready. They moved cautiously, scanning buildings, clearing corners. One of them passed so close that she could see his boots were caked in red clay instead of polished black. Her heart pounded. She didn't understand the words they spoke, but something in their tone didn't match the brutality she'd come to expect. Still, she braced herself for violence. Years of conditioning had taught her that all soldiers brought harm. All soldiers came to take something. Then came a voice, soft and hesitant, breaking the unbearable silence. "Ma'am?" it called. Kim shut her eyes. A pause. Then, gentler still, "It's okay. We're Americans. You're safe now." The words meant nothing to her in language, but something about the tone, cautious, almost pleading, made her pause. She didn't stand. She didn't speak. But something inside her cracked open, just a little. For the first time in years, someone had spoken without demanding, without shouting, without hitting. It was such a foreign experience that she didn't know how to respond. Around her, the other women remained still, unmoving, as if one wrong motion could shatter the fragile spell. The American soldiers kept their distance. One knelt and placed a canteen on the ground, then backed away. Another reached slowly into a pack and left behind a folded blanket. It took nearly an hour before one of the women dared to crawl out from behind the broken wall and take the water. That moment, simple, wordless, tentative, marked the beginning of something none of them understood yet: liberation. But to these women, who had been stripped of identity, hope, and even names, freedom was not a thing they believed in. Not yet, not truly. For them, the sound of unfamiliar boots did not bring joy or relief. It brought confusion, numbness, and disbelief. What came next, the recognition of rescue, the struggle to trust, the beginning of healing, would take weeks, even years. But it all began that morning when footsteps no longer meant pain. The system known as comfort stations was not an accident of war, but a calculated mechanism of control and exploitation. It began in 1932 as the Japanese Empire expanded into China and continued across the Pacific as territories fell under military occupation. Under the guise of preventing unregulated sexual violence and protecting local civilians, the Imperial Army institutionalized forced prostitution. In reality, it was systematic sexual slavery carried out under military supervision and with bureaucratic precision. Tens of thousands of women, Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Burmese, were swept into this machinery. Some were deceived with promises of factory work or nursing jobs. Others were abducted directly from their homes or villages. Families were left behind with no explanation, and in many cases never saw their daughters again. The women were transported in sealed trains, military trucks, and cargo ships to remote outposts. Upon arrival, names were stripped away. Personal belongings were burned. The women were issued a number or nickname recorded in logbooks like equipment. Language was forbidden. Korean women had to speak Japanese, and those who couldn't were beaten. Their rooms were small, windowless cells, often no more than a thin cot and a bucket. Armed guards patrolled the doors, and escape was not considered an option. The schedule was relentless. Women were forced to serve between 20 and 40 soldiers per day. There were no rest days, no holidays. Injuries and illness were ignored unless they interfered with the station's function. Women who showed signs of resistance were punished, sometimes with beatings, sometimes with execution. If a woman fell ill beyond usefulness, she would simply disappear overnight. Medical inspections were regular but brutal. Military doctors were tasked not with treating the women, but with ensuring they were fit for use. Infected women were isolated or removed. Some were forcibly injected with treatments that caused long-term damage. Sterilizations occurred without consent. The goal was to keep the supply line of human bodies functioning for the morale of the troops. Psychological control was just as deliberate. Women were told that the outside world had forgotten them, that escape would only lead to death, that the Japanese emperor himself had ordered their service, and therefore refusal was treason. Over time, many women stopped dreaming of freedom. Their identities dissolved under the weight of daily violation. They became shells, silent, obedient, surviving. The stations themselves were surrounded by secrecy. Civilian populations rarely knew what happened behind the barbed wire, and those who asked too many questions were warned or arrested. Even within the army, younger soldiers were told these women were volunteers, paid workers, or criminals redeeming themselves. In truth, they were captives in every sense of the word. By late 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, these stations had multiplied. From Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, wherever Japanese troops were stationed, comfort stations followed. Many of them were hastily constructed, hidden within larger military compounds, guarded by units trained not only for combat, but for maintaining obedience. The system was vast, but invisible to the world, until the day liberation forces walked in and opened the doors. Kim Sun-hee had been 17 when she was taken. A man had come to her village promising factory jobs in Japan, telling the girls they could send money home. Her parents were poor, and the offer seemed like a blessing. She signed her name, boarded a truck with others, and vanished from her hometown. By the time she realized there was no factory, she was already on a ship bound for the Philippines, guarded by men with rifles who refused to answer questions. The first weeks in captivity were a blur. They were forced to undress, washed with freezing water, examined like livestock. No one explained where they were or what was expected. Then one morning, a soldier opened her cell and pushed her into a small room with a cot and a lantern. A line of soldiers waited outside. That day, she was forced to endure 21 men. She bled through the thin blanket they gave her. Every day followed the same rhythm. At sunrise, the doors unlocked, and the parade began. 10 minutes per soldier. No breaks, no mercy. If she cried, she was slapped. If she screamed, she was gagged. The guards monitored the schedule like clockwork. Efficiency mattered more than pain. They were told not to resist, not to speak, just survive the rotation. Kim learned quickly not to look into the men's eyes. Some were indifferent. Others were cruel. A few apologized under their breath, but none stopped. They treated her as a function, a release valve, not a person. By the end of the first month, her body no longer felt like hers. The bruises didn't fade. Her mind disconnected, floating somewhere outside the room while her body stayed behind. One day, a new girl arrived. She couldn't have been older than 15. She didn't understand what was happening. She cried loudly, begged in Korean, asking for her mother. On her first day, after the fourth soldier, she began to bleed heavily. The guard came in, took one look, and shot her in the head. No one was allowed to speak of it. Her body was removed before nightfall. Kim watched others disappear over time. Girls who collapsed from fever, women who refused to get up, those who simply broke. There was no burial, no ceremony, only silence and a new girl to replace them. The rooms were scrubbed, the cots changed. The station continued, like a machine that swallowed and erased. Even menstruation was not an excuse. They were given rags, told to keep going. If anyone showed signs of illness, they were sent to the Black Room, a place no one returned from. Kim once asked a guard for medicine when her fever hit, and he responded by locking her outside overnight in the rain. She didn't ask again. In the rare, quiet hours before dawn, the women whispered to each other. They shared memories of home, names they had been forced to forget. These moments of humanity were short, risky, but vital. They reminded each other that they had once been daughters, sisters, students, that they had once had names. But as the months became years, those names faded. The station reduced them to numbers. The guards called Kim number 19. That was all she answered to. Her identity dissolved under the weight of repetition, pain, and fear. She stopped waiting for rescue. She no longer believed the world outside remembered them. When the Americans entered the compound, they expected to find retreating Japanese soldiers, or perhaps hidden ammunition stores. What they didn't expect was the silence. There were no shots, no resistance, just eerie stillness and a sense that something had been left behind. As they moved deeper into the buildings, they found them, women, crouched in corners, trembling, avoiding eye contact. They did not scream, they did not speak, they simply waited. Lieutenant Hayes, leading the patrol, ordered his men to lower their weapons. The soldiers were confused. These weren't enemy combatants. These were civilians. But something was wrong. They had never seen civilians react with such terror to rescue. One woman flinched so violently when a soldier offered her food that she slammed her head into the wall. Medical personnel were called in immediately. Captain Helen Morrison, an Army nurse, was among the first to make contact. She tried to approach gently, using a soft tone, but it made no difference at first. The women refused to be touched. They recoiled from blankets, from water, from the smallest act of care. Their minds could not reconcile kindness with authority. What Morrison noticed first was their silence. They did not weep. They did not shout in confusion. They simply obeyed in terrified quiet, expecting punishment for every motion. One woman would not sleep lying down, choosing instead to kneel in the corner, her forehead pressed to the floor. When asked why, she said nothing, but the bruises on her back explained enough. Every attempt at medical examination triggered panic. Even when approached by female nurses, the women hesitated. They had been conditioned to expect pain. Removing clothes, even for treatment, was seen as the beginning of punishment. Morrison noted in her report that it took 2 days before they could convince a single woman to accept a full examination, and only with the help of an interpreter and repeated reassurances. Interpreter Grace Kimura, a Japanese American with the Military Intelligence Service, became an unexpected bridge. At first, the women feared her. She spoke Japanese, the language of their abusers. But then she switched to Korean and told them she was American, born in Hawaii. That changed everything. Her words, spoken in a familiar tongue, began to chip away at the wall of fear. Slowly, the women began to respond. A nod, a glance, a tear. They began accepting food. One even asked for water. These were small signs, but to the Americans, they were everything. It meant there was still someone inside the broken shells they had found. Someone who might heal. The psychological damage was immense. Some women had forgotten their own names. Others could no longer speak their native language after years of forced Japanese instruction. The Americans realized this was not just a medical emergency. It was a humanitarian collapse, a complete destruction of identity and trust. But the process of recovery had begun. The first spark of recognition that these soldiers were not like the others, that perhaps this was not another trick, began to grow. For the women, it was the first time in years that a man had offered something without taking. The concept of being safe would take much longer to believe. But that morning, for the first time, the word freedom was spoken aloud, and someone listened. Recovery was not a single moment. It did not come with the arrival of American soldiers or with the first meal offered without condition. It came in fragments, slowly, unevenly, over days and weeks. For women who had lived under strict routines of abuse and control, even basic autonomy was overwhelming. The idea of choosing when to eat or when to sleep had to be relearned, like a forgotten language. The medical teams began to adapt. Female nurses were prioritized for physical examinations. Cultural interpreters were brought in to explain each procedure before it happened. Still, many women refused to undress. They had been trained to associate medical inspections with judgment, punishment, or selection for death. Trust was not immediate, but it began to form in the quiet spaces between pain and patience. One small turning point came when a nurse gave Kim Sun-hee a bar of soap and a basin of clean water, then left the room. No orders, no guards, just privacy. For the first time in 3 years, Kim washed without eyes watching her, without fear of punishment for how she moved or how long she took. She cried through the whole process. When she stepped out, she whispered her real name. Other women followed. They began speaking in low voices, first to each other, then to the Americans. They shared stories of villages and parents, fragments of prayers, songs half remembered from childhood. Many couldn't recall how long they had been held. Their concept of time was fractured. But in each story, there was one common thread: survival. Among the survivors, bonds had formed long before the arrival of liberators. Older women had shielded younger ones when possible, absorbing beatings in their place or giving up food during periods of starvation. Some had devised small codes: a tap on the wall, a folded cloth, a silent gesture that meant you're not alone. These invisible networks of care had kept them alive. One woman, Li Ming, taught the others how to weave with palm leaves. She said that when your hands were busy, the mind could rest. Rosa, a Filipina teenager, sang to herself each morning, no matter what had happened the night before. Chung Sunun Mi shared her rice with sick roommates, even when she hadn't eaten in 2 days. These quiet acts of defiance sustained hope when nothing else did. The American officers observed these dynamics with awe. They had expected victims and found instead a quiet strength that endured in spite of everything. In official reports, officers stopped referring to the women as rescued prisoners and began calling them survivors. That shift in language mattered. It marked the beginning of seeing them not as broken, but as whole. Fractured, yes, but still whole. To help re-establish identity, medical staff began writing the women's names in Korean or Chinese on simple identification cards. Each name was spoken aloud and repeated like a ritual. These cards were pinned to clean uniforms or folded into bags of donated clothing. They were small, physical reminders that these women had been, and still were, individuals with pasts, families, and dignity. Even simple choices were part of the healing. One day, Kim was asked if she preferred rice or bread. She hesitated, then chose rice. The soldier smiled and said, "Rice it is." It was a moment that passed quickly, but for her, it was enormous. No one had asked her preference in years. In that small exchange, she began to believe that maybe she could choose more than just food. Maybe one day she could choose her future too. Freedom for the comfort women did not mean a return to normal. There was no home waiting with open arms, no community eager to receive them. Many of the survivors feared going back to their villages, terrified of the shame that would follow. In conservative societies, their experiences were not seen as suffering, but as disgrace. Some women chose silence to protect their families. Others remained silent because they no longer had families at all. American and international aid organizations offered assistance, but choices were limited. Some women returned to Korea or China only to find their homes destroyed, their parents gone, their names no longer remembered. Others remained in the Philippines or moved to refugee settlements where no one knew their pasts. A few changed their names entirely, trying to start life over from scratch. Rebuilding was not a linear process. For many, it took years just to speak aloud about what had happened. For some, memory became a burden they locked away. Kim Sun-hee never told her children the full truth. She worked as a seamstress in Seoul, raised 3 daughters, and lived with quiet determination. Her hands bore the strength of someone who had held on when everything else broke. Her eldest daughter once wrote that her mother never cried in front of them, but when she sang old lullabies, her voice would tremble on certain notes. Others found their voice in time. In the 1990s, surviving comfort women began to speak publicly, demanding recognition, apologies, and historical truth. They testified in courts and commissions, holding photos of their younger selves, trying to explain what had been stolen. Their stories were painful, filled with details no one wanted to hear, but they told them anyway, not for pity, but for dignity. They wanted to be remembered, not as victims, but as women who had endured. Their testimony became the backbone of international human rights discussions. Their courage shaped how the world understood wartime sexual violence. Because of their voices, terms like systematic rape, sexual slavery, and gendered war crimes entered legal vocabulary. They forced the world to look at what had once been hidden. They transformed personal horror into public memory. But not every survivor became an activist. Some chose silence, and that choice, too, was valid. For them, healing was private, fragile, not meant for microphones or headlines. They stitched their lives back together in small ways, by raising families, tending gardens, or simply continuing to exist. Their refusal to be consumed by what had happened was itself a quiet form of resistance. Memorials eventually rose in cities across the world: Seoul, Manila, San Francisco. Statues of young girls sitting in chairs, empty seats beside them, symbolizing the women who never returned. These statues weren't just about the past. They were reminders that dignity, once taken, must always be defended. That silence, imposed by shame, must be broken by truth. The legacy of the comfort women is not written only in history books or court transcripts. It lives in every survivor who found the strength to live, in every whisper turned into testimony, in every daughter who grew up seeing strength where the world only saw scars. Their liberation was not just from the Japanese military, but from the chains of invisibility. When Kim Sun-hee died, her children found only one photo from before the war. She had hidden it beneath her sewing machine. In it, she was smiling, her hair tied in a ribbon, a teenager unaware of what was to come. Her daughters kept that photo framed by her bed, Not because it was proof of who she had been, but because it reminded them that survival is a kind of victory, quiet, uncelebrated, but unbreakable. Their stories are not only about what was done to them, but about what they became in spite of it. Survivors, witnesses, women who refused to let history forget. Their silence was not weakness. It was strength waiting for the right moment to speak. And when it did, the world had no choice but to listen.